In this episode, we're getting started on our gameplay ability UI, and by the end of these 4 episodes on the UI, we're going to have a completely functional system for meeting your gameplay needs. So I can hit I on my keyboard, and I can drag and drop each of my abilities to each of my keyboard hotbar slots here. I can also drag them into the inventory, and if I run over a pickup, then I got a new ability. I press 2 on my keyboard, and I've got that ability. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this episode begins a 5-part mini-series on how to create a drag and drop gameplay ability hotbar and inventory system. I've been excited about this series of episodes, but also dreading it at the same time because as much as I love blueprints, UI design is definitely not my forte. But in working to create a gameplay prototype, it's inevitable that we have to do at least some UI design. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it has to work. It at least has to get the job done for what we want to do in the game without interfering with gameplay. And so in this 5-part series, we're going to keep it as simple as possible, but no simpler, and that's going to suffice for our gameplay prototyping. For this first episode today, we're starting just with the UI hotbar, and by the end of the episode, you're going to have a hotbar that you can toggle on or off using I or any other button on your keyboard. Next episode is about ability pickups, like how do we run over an actor, like a visual representation of that ability in the world, and have that automatically come into our hotbar. And then the third episode is about how do we tie that with our actual gameplay ability system. So I can hit a button on my keyboard and it actually activates that ability. And finally, the 4th episode, wrapping up the series, is going to be all about setting up the inventory system and drag and drop with each of those abilities. But you heard me say this is a 5-part series, and that 5th episode is really just a bonus episode. I'm going to go over my very simple process for creating UI buttons. And if you don't like that process, if you got your own UI buttons, totally fine. So just to relate this back to our overall goals for this series, back in episode 26, we began talking about how to conceptualize and begin building out a gameplay ability system from scratch. And so for these next 5 episodes with our gameplay UI, we're focused on the top left quadrant here. So here are our key concepts for today. We're not yet getting into Common UI, which is Unreal Engine's new framework for building out UMG, which is what's available in Unreal Engine out of the box for UI design. We have to walk before we can run, so we're starting simple. And if you're brand new to UI design in Unreal Engine, perfect. This 5-part series is perfect for you. So let's get to it. All right, so we're going to get started today by navigating to the content drawer. We're going to create a brand new folder for our UI, and we'll go into that UI folder, and we're going to start by creating a few widget blueprints that we need. And widget blueprints make up the backbone of UMG, which stands for Unreal Motion Graphics, and that's what we're going to use to create our hotbar. So we're going to right click, and we're going to go under User Interface, and we're creating a new widget blueprint. And our parent class is going to be User Widget. Select. And this one we're going to call our Ability Hotbar. And then I'll right click, I'm going to duplicate this one, and I'm going to call this one our Hotbar Slot. So basically this one is an individual item slot, and on our hotbar we're going to have 10 total slots across the bottom of our screen. And then the last one we need for this episode, we're going to once again right click and duplicate, and this is going to be our HUD, or heads up display. So our HUD is going to contain all of these widget blueprints. So if you ever play a game where you hit I and it pops up your inventory and you got the whole heads up display, that's exactly what it's going to do here. And we're going to set up our third person character blueprint to activate our HUD, but the first thing we need to do is we need to create a new player controller. So let's navigate over to our player controller folder and we'll create a new one. And that's going to be in my core folder here. And if you're unfamiliar with the player controller, I've talked about this a little bit in a previous episode, but basically a player controller is the interface between the pawn and the human player controlling it. And the pawn is our third person character. And the player controller essentially represents the human player's will. And the reason that the player controller is relevant in this case is we're going to store all of our gameplay abilities on the player controller. So the way I'm thinking about this is that our character can die, and we don't want our character to lose all their abilities if they die. So the controller is going to stay consistent throughout the entire game. And so we're going to create a new player controller blueprint class, and that's what's going to allow us to actually put our gameplay abilities on the controller. So to do that, we're going to right click and go to blueprint class, and it's going to be a child of our player controller class. And I'm just going to name this my player controller. And we'll go into that. So the first thing we need to do is on the event graph, we need to create a reference to our third person character. So on event begin play, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get player character, and then we're going to cast to our third person character, and we'll connect this up, and then we'll promote as BP third person character to a variable. And I'm just going to rename this to character reference, and then compile and save. So now that we set up the basics for our player controller, now we have to assign this my player controller to our game mode, and that's what specifies what controller we're actually using for our player. So to do that, I'll go back to the content drawer, and you'll need to find your BP third person game mode. So I put it in the core folder back in episode 3 of this series, all the way back in the beginning. So I'll go into that, and I'm going to change my player controller class here to instead be my player controller, and then compile and save. And this is a really important step. So if you don't change your game mode, then the new controller that you set up, it's not going to be used by the game. But then we can exit right out of this. So we are done with the My Player controller for this episode. Let's exit out of that. And now let's set up our Hotbar slot. So I'll go back to the content drawer and back to content, back to UI, and we'll go into the Hotbar slot. So these widget blueprints, I gotta say, there was the highest learning curve for me of almost anything I've done in Unreal Engine when I first started working with them. They are pretty difficult to get used to. So if this is kind of weird, I totally understand, but I'm gonna walk you through it and we'll go from there. So the way these are built is we have different components and we can arrange those components in a specific hierarchy. So we have kind of the outline of a button, and then we have a button, and then we have a number within a button and an image within a button. So it's a thing within a thing within a thing. And so the first thing we need is if we go up to border here, we drag that down under Hotbar slot. And the next thing we need is what's called a uniform grid panel. Search for that and then drag that into our border. And the next thing we need is a button, and we'll drag that into the uniform grid panel. And the button's what's actually going to be clickable on our user interface. And then within the button, we have what's called a size box. And within the size box, we have our button image, whatever that might be. So we search for image and get our image. And then also within the button, we're going to have a text component. And the text is going to display anywhere from 1 to 9, like our keyboard buttons, and then 0 all the way at the end. And so if I drag my text and I try to put it under button, it doesn't let me do that. So that's why we needed the uniform grid panel. So that's going to be at the same level of the button, but really the text is going to be encapsulated by the button. And so now we need to make some modifications to the details of each of these individual components that are part of the widget blueprint. So I'm going to start by going to the text. And when you select that, then you see our details panel here on the right. First thing I'm going to modify is the text here. So you see the text block, it's actually displaying that right there. I'm going to change that to instead just be 0. And this text, even though I'm setting it to 0 right now, it's going to go from 1 to 9 and then 0. And that's going to change. We're going to bind it to a variable. And you'll see that later on. So a couple other things we're going to do with our text here. So I want to make sure it's right aligned, like the top right corner of our button. So I'll choose horizontal alignment right. And then we'll go under font here. And I'm going to change the typeface to be regular. And we'll make the size 10. Under advanced here, I want to update the margin. So we'll go under advanced and then margin, and we're just going to change the top and the bottom. So the top and the bottom are going to be 3 and the left and the right are still 0. All right, that's it for our text here. So let's go over to our border component, and we only have to do one thing here. So under the brush, we're basically going to hide the border. So the draw as, we're going to draw it as none. And now we've got a much more normal looking size button. Now we move on to the button, and then we have to go under interaction and advanced. And we have to specify how we're going to actually interact with the button. So the click method and the touch method. I think the touch method is actually for like a gamepad, but we're going to do both. So the click method is going to be precise click, and the touch method, we're going to select precise tap. I haven't actually tested this with a gamepad, but in all the tutorials I've seen, this is what they do. Next, we have to go under appearance and style here, and we have to change our styles here for normal, hovered, and pressed. And this is how our button's going to look. Normal status, and then when it's hovered over, and then when it's actually pressed down. So I'll start with the normal. We'll expand that, also in the tint here. And I'm going to make the tint 000, so that's black. But the alpha is going to be 0.25, so almost transparent. And we're going to draw it as a rounded box. And if I go under outline settings here, just make sure your corner radii are 4 by 4 by 4 by 4. That looks good. And the rounding type is a fixed radius. And then we'll expand hovered, and we'll expand the tint. And for the hovered, I'm going to make this a bright yellow. So R1, G1, B0. And the alpha here is going to be 0.5. So still kind of translucent, but not quite as transparent as our normal button. And we're keeping that drawing as a rounded box, and outline settings, same thing. And what this controls are the rounded edges of our button. So we want to make sure the button actually appears to have rounded edges, sort of like an iPhone or Android. You know, it's just a more modern look than a square button. Then we have some updates to make for the padding of the button. So under normal padding here, so you see how much space is to the left and right of this button? We're going to shrink that immensely. So the left is going to be 0.7, the top is 0.5, the right is 0.8, slightly more padding on the right, and the bottom is 0.5. And then for pressed padding, we're going to do the same exact thing. So left 0.7, top 0.5, right 0.8, bottom 0.5. Make sure to keep your color and opacity here 111 with an alpha of 1. It's important to keep that 1. Last thing here, so instead of fill screen up here, if you just come and say desired on screen, then it shrinks it down to a normal size. I'm just going to compile and save at this point, and that's going to resize our 0, so it's almost within our button, not quite. So we still got a couple other things to do. So let's go over to our size box now. And if I expand the padding for our size box, I'm going to make all these 2, so 2 by 2 by 2. And you see that's placing our 0 more into our button. And then under the child layout here, we're going to do a width override and a height override. And we're just going to make it 64 by 64. So really quick, I messed up one thing in the text. So if we go back to text, I realized our text is kind of sticking out past the edge of our button. What I messed up is we got to change our margin to the right. We got to set that to 3. Bottom is 0. And so this is going to be 0 left, 3 top, 3 right. So there's a little bit of padding from the right side and the top. And so if you don't see that 0 at all because it's covered by the button, that's perfect. So the last piece of our setup of the widget on the designer tab. So we're going to go to our image. And for this, we have to actually bind it to a variable because the image is going to change if we have an actual ability in the slot. And so the way we bind it to a variable is over here on the right side in the details under brush, under bind here, we're going to create a binding. And that brings us from the designer tab, which is basically how the widget blueprint is going to look on the screen. That brings us over to the graph, which is what is this widget blueprint actually going to do? And we created this get brush 0. Just going to make some space here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable under variables here. And I'll title this our ability image. And the type is going to be a texture 2D. Texture 2D. And an object reference. We want to make sure that this is instance editable and exposed on spawn. So make sure to select that as well. Instance editable, exposed on spawn. Because this image is going to be passed in via our gameplay ability pickup that we're setting up next episode. So next we have to drag in a reference to our ability image, get, and we're going to make brush from texture. And then we'll connect it up right here. So now we have some additional setup for our hotbar slot on the event graph. So I'll navigate over to the event graph. And let's start by creating a few additional variables. So the first one, I'll hit plus sign. This is going to be our number on keyboard. And you might think that this is going to be an integer, but if you remember, it's actually text, so it has to be a string. So we've got to select a string type for this. And again, it has to be instance editable and exposed on spawn. I don't know why every other blueprint, the details panel's on the right, and here it's on the left. I think that's one of the things that threw me off about UMG, but it's a little weird. And let's compile and save, and then we can give it a default value of 1. Compile and save again, and now let's go back to the designer tab. Let's go back to our text component here. And once we've selected our text component, we can come over to text over here on the right hand side, and we're going to bind what's here to that variable, to that number on keyboard. And that way for each hotbar slot, when we actually create the hotbar, we can specify, okay, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and you'll see how we do that. And we've got to create several more variables. So I'll hit plus sign. And our next one's going to be our hotbar slot. And this one is going to be an integer. For all of these, instance editable and exposed on spawn. And the next one is going to be slot activated. And this one's going to be a Boolean. And then we need to create what are called button styles. And we're going to end up creating 3 of these, but we're just going to start with 1. We're going to set it up and then we'll duplicate it just to save some time. And the button styles, well, think of this as setting the style of the button. So should the button be transparent? Should it contain the image? Should it be lit up if it's hovered over? Stuff like that. So then I'll hit plus sign and we'll create our ability style, button style, and that's our variable type. So button style. And once again, I'll make it instance editable and exposed on spawn. Compile and save. So now we got to set what this ability style is actually going to be. And this is going to be the style of the button when we have an ability in that button slot, but it's not actually activated yet. So I'll expand it down here. And then under the normal here, I'll expand tint. And the tint is going to be 111 until we get to the alpha. And that's going to be 0.25. So pretty transparent. And we're going to draw that as a rounded box. The next thing we're going to do is under outline settings here. So remember we set our corner radii to 4 by 4 by 4. We're going to do the same thing here. So 4, 4, 4, 4. And the other important thing to change here is the rounding type. So it's got to be a fixed radius. Otherwise you're going to get a circle button. So now we can come back up, we can collapse normal, and we can expand hovered. And so for hovered, we're going to give this a tint of bright green. So you got to think about it in terms of if you're hovering your mouse over an ability that's not yet activated, what color should it display to indicate that, hey, if you click this, it's going to activate it. So I think green makes sense. So we'll give it a tint of 0 by 1 by 0. And the alpha I'll keep at 1, and that'll keep it a bright green because the image is going to be right in the middle. And then the outline is all that's going to be shown. And once again, we're going to draw this as a rounded box. And we'll go under outline settings again, corner radii 4 by 4 by 4 by 4, and the rounding type, again, fixed radius. So last one, I'll come back up, collapse hovered, and then open pressed. So for pressed, I'm keeping the tint 1 by 1 by 1. It's going to be bright white, so that just indicates that the ability was activated. But once again, we'll draw it as a rounded box, and under outline settings here, corner radii 4 by 4 by 4, and it's going to be fixed radius. And so now we're all set for our ability style, our first button style. And now what we can do is we can duplicate it and name it wild style. I've got the Lego movie stuck in my head. We're not going to name it wild style. We're going to duplicate it and name it activated ability style. Ability style. Got a 6-year-old. And then for activated ability style, I'll compile and save and expand that. In the activated ability style, because it's already activated, under normal, the alpha is not going to be 0.25 under tint. So this is going to be a full 1. It's going to be bright white. But we shouldn't need to change any other settings because we already set them based on the first one. We got a rounded box and our outline settings there. Good to go. Now I'll collapse normal and I'll come under hovered. So if an ability is already activated and then we're going to hover over it to deactivate, then that's going to be a red tint because that's going to indicate to the player, okay, if you click this, it's going to deactivate the ability. So I'll expand our tint there, and our tint's going to be 1 by 0 by 0, and alpha of 1, bright red. And for our pressed, it's the same as it is currently. So still 1 by 1 by 1, alpha of 1. All good there. Compile and save. All right, we're going to duplicate our ability style again. Duplicate. This is going to be empty button style. So this is our style of a button when there's no ability in the slot. Compile and save. Open that up. So our normal, exactly the same. 0 by 0 by 0 and 0.25. And then under hovered, well, we don't want it to be green because nothing's going to be activated if there's no ability there, right? So for the tint, I'll expand that. And it's going to be 1 by 1. It's going to be a yellow, but not so bright. Kind of a subtle yellow, so 0.25 alpha. And then when it's pressed, same kind of thing. So it's going to be a dull white. So under pressed, I'll just expand under tint, and it's going to be a 0.25 alpha. So we are all set for our button styles now. So I'll compile and save, and the next thing we have to do is actually in this event construct. So I can delete out event tick and event pre-construct. We won't need those. So under this event construct, we have to set up our references to go back to our player character and actually also back to our player controller. So I can right click, get player controller, and from that I can drag out a pin and cast to my player controller. And you're only going to have the option to cast to this if you've already set up the player controller in the game mode like we did earlier. And then you got to right click here. We're going to promote this to a variable. And of course, I'll rename it. So right click here. It's going to be our player controller reference. Now we got to get our character reference. So we'll right click, get player character. Again, we'll cast to ThirdPerson BP ThirdPerson Connect that up. Promote this also to a variable. And I'll rename this one. So this I'm going to rename to ThirdPerson. Always mess up capitalization. ThirdPerson reference. And so now we need to set up our hotbar slot to actually change the button style depending on what's going on with the button. And so for that, I'm going to come over to the left of our event graph. We're going to create a brand new event. So I'll search for custom event. And this custom event is going to be called set button style. And basically, we're going to call this event anytime anything happens to a slot. So did an ability go in? Did it get activated? Did an ability go out? And it's going to reset the style each and every time that happens. So the first thing that we're going to check is, does this hotbar slot currently have a valid image? Because if it has a valid image, we want to change the style to display the image. And if not, we want to change it to be more transparent. So we'll get our ability image and we'll drag that in, get, and then we'll check to see, is it valid? And then if it's valid, we'll branch off of that, connect this up. Now, if it's true, that means we've moved an ability into the slot because we put an image into the slot. Those two things are going to correlate with one another. But when that happens, then we also need to figure out, okay, is our ability activated? And so we've got to get our slot activated Boolean, drag that in, and we'll assess that because if it's activated, it's going to have a different style than if it's just in there but not activated. So I'm going to move over a little bit. And then if it is activated, we're going to get aptly titled our activated ability style. And then we're going to get a reference to our button, and the button is what we're actually going to set this style on. So set style, and make sure to choose this one down here, appearance. True is going to connect up here, and activated ability style right like that. Now, if the slot activated is false, what's going to happen? Well, we still need a button style, right? But it's not going to have that white border all around. So for that, we're just going to get our simple ability style, And we can copy our reference to our button, and we're going to do the same thing. So I'll drag out a pin and set style. This one, appearance. Connect up our false branch, connect up this, move this out a little bit. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to set the opacity. So basically, if a button is not in the slot, we want it to be somewhat transparent, right? So a 0.25 alpha. But if an ability is in the slot, then it's going to have an image. We don't want that image to be translucent. We want it to be alpha of 1. And so in that case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get our image that's actually on the button. So get image. And we're going to set the color and opacity, set color and opacity. And I'm going to connect both these up, this up here and this up here, because for both of these, we're going to have a button in that slot. And then for the in color and opacity here, I'll right click and promote to variable. So I'm going to compile and save, and that way I can set the default in color and opacity. And the default is going to be R and G and B, all 1, and the alpha of 1. Now we still have a branch here to set up, so that's our false branch here, and that's when we're going to use our empty button style. So we can get a reference to the button and the style. We can copy and paste that down here. Get a reference to our empty button style, get, connect that up right like that, and connect up the false branch here. Because what this is indicating is we haven't assigned an ability image to the button. And if that's the case, it should be a translucent button. There's nothing in that slot. And so once again, I can get a reference to our image here, and I can set color and opacity and connect this up just like this, and right click promote to variable. Drag it down here, and I'm going to rename this one. This is going to be no ability color and opacity. And once again, compile and save, and we'll come into that, and it's going to be RGB all 0 and an alpha of 0.25. So pretty dark, but translucent. So compile and save, and the last thing I'm going to do up here after our references, so immediately on event construct, what we're going to do is we're going to call this event, and it's going to set our button styles automatically. So we can drag out a pin and set button style. Just like that. Compile and save. So now let's set up our ability hotbar to actually contain our buttons. So we'll keep this open for now because we're going to come back to it. But content drawer, and let's go into our ability hotbar. So once again, we've got to create a hierarchy for this UI widget. So we're going to start with a border, drag that in. Next is going to be a horizontal box, because we're going to have buttons going across. And then we got a size box because we're going to size each of those buttons. And then last but not least, we got a uniform grid panel, and that's going to evenly space everything out. Uniform grid panel under size box. And actually that's not last, so let's exit out of this, and we have to go under user created because these contain our personally created widgets, including our hotbar slot. So we got to drag in our slot under the uniform grid panel, and that's our first one. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select it, Control C copy, Control V paste, 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 paste. We're going to get from 1 to 9. And I'm actually going to paste it one more time, and then for the last one, I'm going to rename that. It's going to be hotbar slot number 0. And then we can delete out the very first one because each of these slots is going to correspond with a keyboard button. So once again, in the top right corner, instead of fill screen, let's select desired on screen. And you'll see that every single one of those slots is stacked on top of each other. So how do we space them out? So I'm going to select the size box here, and we're going to override our size. So under width override, height override, so we're going to set this to 770. And the height is going to be 70. And then I'll go over to border, and once again we're going to draw as none. So under brush, under draw as none. And so now we need to update each of the individual hotbar slots. So it's time consuming. We're going to start with 1 and work our way down. So for 1 here, our number on keyboard, keep that to 1, and our hotbar slot, keep that to 0. And our row and our column are also 0, 0. But for each subsequent one, that's going to be updated. So hotbar slot 2, our row is still 0, but our column is now 1. And you see it evenly spacing these because they're all in the uniform grid panel. But for this one, the number on the keyboard, that's going to be 2. And these are our user parameters that are on each slot. And that's why we made them exposed. And the hotbar slot is actually going to be 1. And this is a little confusing, but let me try to explain it. So we got on our keyboard, we got 1 through 9 and then 0, right? But these actual buttons are going to be stored in an array. And whenever you build an array, it always starts with 0. So the keyboard 1 is actually going to be array element 0. So it means that our array elements are always going to be 1 less than whatever the keyboard button is. Little confusing, but try to keep that in your head. So now under hotbar slot 3, it's going to be column 2. And then our number on keyboard is going to be 3, and our hotbar slot is 2. Got to make sure I don't mess these up. Very easy to mess up these numbers. So hotbar slot 4, same kind of thing. So column 3, number on keyboard 4, hotbar slot 3. So it should be 3, 4, 3. So the middle number should always be 1 up. Hotbar slot 5, going to be 4, 5, 4. Hotbar slot 6, it's going to be 5, 6, 5. Hotbar slot 7. 6, 7, 6. And you see it's starting to build, starting to get there. Hotbar slot 8. 7, not 18, 8, 7. Up to 9, 8, 9, 8. And 0. Column is 9. Number on keyboard is 10. Hotbar slot 9. Now it's starting to look like a hotbar. Let's compile and save, and now let's go over to our graph. So once again, we have kind of a time-consuming process. So first, delete out the pre-construct, delete out the event tick. We got to drag in a reference to each one of these hotbar buttons. Get, you could just hold Control and drag it in, and that just does a get right away. You got to drag in every single one. And then we're going to arrange them to make them nice and pretty. And make sure to put 0 all the way at the end. Very easy to mess that up. All right, 1 through 9 and 0. So now we got to make an array from these buttons. So we're going to drag out a pin and make array. And add pin, we're going to do that 8 more times, all the way down to 9. And then connect each one of these up. And make sure 1 to 0, 2 to 1, etc. So 0 should be connected to 9 down here. Then we got to promote this array to a variable. Connect it up to event construct. And I'm going to call this array our hotbar buttons. And we're going to reference this anytime we need to update our hotbar buttons. Compile and save. So we started with our hotbar slot, we set up our hotbar, and now it's moving up the chain, up to our HUD. So let's go back into our content drawer and open up our HUD. And for this one, the hierarchy is very simple. So we're just going to put in a canvas panel, and the canvas panel indicates that this is going to be our entire screen. And then once again, we have to expand under user created, get our ability hotbar, and pull it in there. And to start, we'll select our ability hotbar, and we'll select size to content. That's going to make our hotbar a normalized size. And then we're going to click and drag the entire thing down, down, down to the bottom middle of the screen, right about there. You want the center to be aligned with this center line right there. And then we need to anchor it to the bottom middle there. So under anchors, just going to select anchors and bottom middle right there. And then we've got to select our HUD over there on the details panel, and we have to change our visibility from not hit testable, which means our mouse cannot interact with our HUD. We need to change that to visible. And if I look at the help text there, it says visible and hit testable can interact with our cursor. And we're going to do the same thing for our canvas panel and our ability hotbar. So canvas panel, make our visibility instead of not hit testable to visible. Same thing with our ability hotbar here. Visibility, visible. Compile and save. So now let's go into our third person character blueprint and begin setting up our HUD to actually be displayable. So we'll go to content drawer, my third person character blueprints under content, and then core, and then our BP third person character. So we have to zoom out. We've got to go all the way up to our event graph, begin play, all the way up here. And once again, we have to set up some references. So I'm going to get our player controller, get player controller, and we're going to cast to our my player controller. And if you don't see that, again, make sure your My Player Controller blueprint is in your game mode. So I'll move over here, and then I'll right click, promote this to a variable, and I'll change the name, and it's going to be our Player Controller reference. And I'm going to expand our details over here, and I'm going to give it a category instead of default over to references. We've done that previous episodes. And I can comment this, and I'm just going to say Player Controller reference. We'll go on past that. And from here, right on event begin play, now we're going to create a new widget, create widget. And the class is going to be, well, our HUD. And I'll also right click on this and promote it to a variable. And this is going to be called aptly HUD reference. Actually, don't capitalize the U and the D. Just keep it HUD reference. And I'll also give it a category of references. And I'll drag out a pin, and we're going to add to viewport. Add to viewport. I don't know why it does that. Get rid of that. Just like that. And then I'll come back and comment this, and this is going to be create our HUD. Create HUD. All right, so now we've got to reference our HUD in our actual hotbar slot. And that's not going to be relevant until next episode, but next episode it'll be important. So let's not forget that. So go to hotbar slot. And right between, I'm just going to delete this line here. And this is where we're going to set up our HUD reference. So as BP third person character, we could just get our HUD reference, and we can promote this to a variable. And then connect this up here, and we can keep it HUD reference. I think that's totally fine. Compile and save. Now back to our third person character, and we're nearing the end of this setup for this episode. So we're going to go all the way down to the bottom of our event graph. And so this is where we're going to activate our HUD. And really whatever button you want to use to activate it, it's entirely up to you. I'm just going to use keyboard button I So I'm going to right click and we're going to do a keyboard I, and I have to scroll down, scroll down, scroll down, and there it is. And also for this, I'm going to do a simple flip-flop. I know I said in episode 4, I think, never do flip-flops, but you know what? For the inventory, it's either open or closed. So we're going to do a flip-flop. And so I got to get our player controller reference. And from here, I can set our input mode. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to use the mouse once our UI is actually open. And our in widget to focus is going to be our HUD. So get that, connect that up. And if I come over a little bit, so now we've got another variable, and this is going to be connected to our controller. So I'll drag in another reference to our controller, and the variable is going to be show mouse cursor. And we can set that. So when our UI is triggered, then we're going to set this to true. And then when it's flip-flopped off, then we're going to set this to false. So I can copy this down here, paste it, and B, connect this up, uncheck that. And I think now we're all set, unless I forgot something. So compile and save. So let's test this out. So I know I've already messed this up a little bit, but I got most of it right because look, we've got our buttons down there. Each of them have a number from 1 to 10. I can't really see the numbers all that well because our buttons are transparent white in color, and I want them to be transparent black in color. So we'll adjust that. But then the real test is if I hit I. So do I get my mouse cursor when I hit I? Oh, there it is. It appears. And then I can hover over the buttons, and they each turn yellow. Why? Because I don't have anything yet in the buttons. So far so good. So let's just correct the coloring here, and then we should be good to go for our next episode. So our problem is with the empty button style that we set up. So let's go back into that. So if we go back to our hotbar slot here, and specifically let's select our empty button style. And if you come down under the empty button style, we set our initial normal. So the normal button, it actually had a tint that was white. So it's 1 times 1 times 1. Now, if you like that, you can keep that as is, but I'm going to change that tint to be black. So we're going to do R0 and G also 0. And for some reason, once I hook up these styles, it just takes a few seconds for my computer to process it each time I change something. So G is 0, and then B is also 0, and our alpha is staying 0.25. So it's still going to be translucent as an empty button. Make sure you do this on the empty button style and just for the normal here. And that should do it. So let's compile, we'll save, we'll test it out one more time. All right, so now we've got our darker buttons, but I see another issue, which is our last button is 10. So very easy to make those kinds of mistakes. So we've got to go back into our hotbar slot. And I actually have to go back to the designer tab, because if you remember in our hotbar slot under our text here, we assigned that, we bound it to the number on keyboard. And so that was defined on our ability hotbar itself for each of our abilities. So I got to go to our designer tab, and our hotbar slot 0, sure enough, number on keyboard 10. Let's switch that to 0. Compile and save. So I actually needed to restart my project in order to get it to show up properly, but now it is showing up properly. And if I hit I on my keyboard, I get my mouse cursor, and once again, we got our yellow highlighting. So we're all set for our initial hotbar setup. So in our next episode, we're going to set up our gameplay ability pickups. So we'll have an actor that you can just run over, and instantly it'll fall to that first slot of our hotbar. So I hope to see you there.